so much history and science behind what this might be.
It's kind of moving around a little.
And parts from me were found and thrown in with my son.
Calling boo hags the most dreaded creature in South Carolina folklore.
Is it supposed to be getting closer?
I don't know.
These spirits are drawn to this beautiful blue, and they get trapped inside, and when the sun comes up, the bad spirit, the haint, will be destroyed.
And they appear to be moving extremely slowly.
Again, this has been reported for generations.
Am I really seeing this? What is this?
Well, my name is Rich Thomas, and I am a 27-year resident of Hilton Head Island, full-time. I actually started coming to Hilton Head in 1971 after my parents had retired down here in what were the early days of the Sea Pines Plantation. My mother was active civically, and she had a number of friends, one of whom was a woman whose name was Virginia Holmgren. And Virginia wrote a book on Hilton Head called Hilton Head Island, A Sea Island Chronicle. And my mother gave me that book in 1974. And I read about Hilton Head and its 500 years of incredible history. And that captivated my attention at that time. Subsequent to that, I became a fairly avid military historian, focused on the Civil War, World War I and World War II. And when I came across the deep Civil War history of Hilton Head and the surrounding area, and especially that of the commanding generals here at the Department of the South, I was absolutely captivated by the story of Ormsby McKnight Mitchel. He was a remarkable Renaissance man, is probably the best way to put it. Multi-talented, absolutely brilliant, childhood prodigy in mathematics. He came from a family whose mother and father had emigrated to Kentucky from North Carolina. There were 6 children, of which he was the youngest. And when his father died, he ended up becoming a circuit judge. His father died on a trip. And his mother decided to move the children from near Morganville, Kentucky, to live with her daughter in Lebanon, Ohio. And so General Mitchel grew up in Lebanon, attended school in Lebanon, but was also homeschooled by his mother, who recognized his incredible intellect. He started at a very early age becoming interested in astronomy. And at age 12, he left home to go to Oxford, Ohio, a town about 20 miles away, where there was a school at the time that later becomes Miami University. And what he would do is he would work at a local mercantile store. And after he worked at the store for a full shift, he would go do odd jobs so he could earn money to pay the librarian at the college to let him read the latest textbooks on astronomy. And his love of astronomy will follow him all the way through the rest of his life, especially his military career, where he becomes known to his troops as Old Stars. That was his nickname. But anyway, General Mitchel will apply, the youngest applicant, to apply for an appointment to West Point, which he does at age 14. He's rejected the first year, and then he applies again the second year with a congressman. And this time he's accepted. And the following year, at age 16, he walks from Oxford, Ohio, basically to the Hudson River Valley in New York to attend classes at West Point. He'll go on, he'll graduate 13th in a class of 49, right behind 2 later very famous Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee, who was first in his class, and a man named Sidney Johnston, who was number 12. Anyway, Mitchel will go on and be assigned to the Corps of Engineers, but before he actually gets deployed, they will note his proficiency in mathematics and make him an associate professor of math at West Point. He'll do that for a couple of years, and then he's stationed in Florida for the Seminole conflicts that were taking place at the time. He had fallen in love up in New York State with a woman named Louisa Clark. He'll serve in Florida for almost a year, and then his time comes up to be able to resign his commission, which he does. And then he and his wife will move back to Ohio. And in 1834, he graduates a class of 1829, in 1834, he accepts a position as a professor of astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics at what then was called the College of Cincinnati, today the University of Cincinnati. He'll hold that position for about 10 years, and for a couple of years right in the middle of that, he becomes employed as the chief engineer for the Little Miami Railroad. Little Miami Railroad just starting to build in that area, and he didn't drive trains, he designed the railroad. But he'll do that, and then he will, all of a sudden the college burns down. His salary is taken away. He can't really think about how to support himself and his family, except that he had started giving lectures on astronomy locally, and they seemed to go over pretty well. And so he decides he's going to give lectures and be paid to give lectures on astronomy. And he travels, and in a 14-year period, he'll travel to almost every city in the United States, travel to Paris and London as a lecturer on astronomy. And then he will come back to the Ohio area having accumulated not only enough money to support himself, but enough money to begin thinking about building an observatory. And a man named Longworth will then give 4 acres and what amounts to about $50,000, a large sum of money at the time, to him to build an observatory west of Cincinnati on the top of Mount Adams, which he does. He'll build a lot of it single-handedly, mixing the cement and putting it in place, pouring it himself. But then he finally is able to bring in crews to help him complete it. He'll serve at that observatory, which was called Mitchel Observatory in the beginning, for 14 more years. And then in 1859, he's offered to take a position at a new observatory in New York State that Harvard College had just completed, supposed to be the finest of its kind. So he takes a job at that observatory in New York, and a year later, year and a half later, the Civil War erupts. He's given a commission as a brigadier general of volunteers, moves back to Ohio, takes over troops as a division commander, about 12,000 men under him. He'll lead the Army of the Ohio in the attacks on Nashville, Tennessee, and later on Huntsville, Alabama. Because of his brilliance as a tactician, he'll be promoted very quickly up the line and sent back after the victory at Huntsville, sent back to Washington, D.C., where he is given a planning job, and he hates it. He wants to get back into the field. So he lobbies with the members of Lincoln's cabinet, with every congressman he can get his hands on, and finally a field assignment becomes vacant, and that was the one here on Hilton Head. His predecessor, a man named David Hunter, had been relieved because he had decided to issue an emancipation order freeing all the slaves in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. And President Lincoln wasn't ready for that. So Hunter was relieved, creating the opening for General Mitchel. And the story of General Mitchel's arrival on Hilton Head is a different chapter, and probably one of the things that results in his primary legacy. Welcome to Fort Mitchel. General Ormsby McKnight Mitchel at your service. Welcome to my command, or our command. But I should say it was my command about 162 years ago, when I came to Hilton Head as the 3rd commanding general of the Federal Department of the South, which was headquartered here on Hilton Head Island. You may remember at the beginning of the war, things weren't going too well for the Union. We suffered a number of embarrassing defeats in front of the eyes of the nation, up in the fields of Virginia, right near Washington, D.C. And Mr. Lincoln and the administration were not too happy with the results of the battles that had occurred so far. And a lot of pressure was being put on the field commands to wage war and garner a major victory that the Union could tout, because there was increasing pressure from the oppositional groups in the North to end the war and give the South its independence. Well, the military strategy for waging war was clear as far as the ground troops went. Just go into the Confederate states, capture their state capitals, and command and control from that location. But for the naval side, it wasn't as clear. So President Lincoln, 1 week after the shots are fired at Fort Sumter, declared that a blockade be put on all Confederate ports. And a board was convened headed by Admiral Samuel DuPont. And after a couple of weeks of deliberation and planning, that board came out with a recommendation that 4 blockading squadrons be formed. And those squadrons would have a different piece of the coastline, from Virginia all the way down to the tip of Florida, from the tip of Florida all the way over to Galveston, Texas, along the coast. And it was difficult to even imagine how that could happen at the time because the Union Navy only had 47 ships total. And they calculated that they would need a minimum of 250 to pull it off. So each squadron was given a piece of the coastline for them to blockade, and each squadron command had to choose where was going to establish its base of operations. And the southeast coast of the United States really only had 3 viable candidates, of which the Port Royal Sound was one. And the Port Royal Sound was the logical one because it's the second deepest and second largest natural harbor on the East Coast. And President Lincoln also had a personal interest in this location because he wanted, if possible, in this major Union victory, to deal a powerful psychological blow on the Confederacy. And in the minds of the people in the North, this was considered to be the epicenter of secession and the heartland of slavery. And so this was Lincoln's choice. Although he didn't personally make it, his influence weighed heavy in the calculation. So you know the story. The Battle of Port Royal Sound is what eventually occurs in the waters immediately off Hilton Head. It begins on October 28th when the fleet leaves Newport News, Virginia. They hit a hurricane when they're rounding Cape Fear. It disperses the fleet. Several boats founder. Some are damaged. Their boilers are compromised. 2 ships sink. The men are rescued. But then the ships have to make their way piecemeal to the destination where their orders dictated, which is the mouth of the Port Royal Sound. So over the subsequent days, from about November 3rd until November 5th, ships keep coming in. And on the morning of the 5th, Admiral DuPont orders a small flotilla of warships to go into the mouth of Port Royal Sound to test the fire from the 2 Confederate forts guarding its mouth. They come back, report that in fact the Confederate fire is very accurate and they have plenty of range. And at the same time, the commander of all the land forces, who was my predecessor as the first departmental commander for the Department of the South, a general named Thomas Sherman, not any relative that we know of to William Tecumseh. He comes to DuPont and tells him that they lost 300 of the 500 landing craft that were originally scheduled to deliver the troops on shore for this amphibious invasion that was to capture those 2 forts guarding the mouth of the Sound and the rest of the areas around it. Well, DuPont was secretly happy because he had never worked with General Sherman before and wasn't sure about his performance in combat. So it now became a naval-only operation. It was a short battle. The ships adopted sailing in an elliptical fashion. They would fire their starboard cannons at one fort as they entered the Sound. They'd turn, they'd reload, then they'd fire those same cannons at the other fort as they exited the Sound. This went on for approximately 3 hours, and by about 12:30 on November 7th of 1861, there was no return fire coming from the Confederacy. And the Union came ashore and started occupying Fort Walker, which was the prior Confederate fort. They started rebuilding it. They renamed it Fort Wells. They also, on November 8th, the next day, captured the city of Beaufort, captured Fort Beauregard on the other side of the Sound. So Union control of the Port Royal Sound area was in effect by November 10th of 1861. The day after the invasion, on November 8th, General Sherman went to his chief engineer, who was a brilliant young man, first in his class at West Point, a captain at the time named Quincy Adams Gilmore, and instructed Captain Gilmore to conduct a reconnaissance of the shores of Hilton Head Island and to locate suitable locations at which to build fortifications to protect against a possible Confederate counterattack. And like every Union commander in the war before him, Sherman overestimated the strength of the Confederates. The force of 13,000 men that landed and occupied the Port Royal Sound area was far greater than the number of Confederates combined in both Savannah and south of Charleston. But nevertheless, they wanted to protect the Union main camp at Fort Wells. So Captain Gilmore marched along the shores of Hilton Head Island, came to the mouth of Skull Creek, turned to the south and the west, and came along the shore to the area that was a wide open cotton field on the Seabrook Plantation. And as he stood in this location, he looked and noticed, we have a clear field of vision all the way down to the opening from the Calabogie Sound coming from the Savannah direction. We have a clear field of vision all the way up to the Port Royal Sound for any vessels coming in this direction. And this also happens to be the narrowest point between Pinckney Island, directly across from us, and the shore of Skull Creek on Hilton Head. Perfect place to build a fort. So Gilmore gives instructions to begin building what we have here today. And this was really not a fort. A fort needs to be enclosed on all four sides. This was a coastal battery, and it was called a lunette-style battery. And as you can tell, as you look at the shape of the walls of the fort, it resembles a crescent moon. And on this crescent moon fort walls, at one time there were 3 gun platforms. Each of those platforms held 2 cannons. The fort was originally designed by Gilmore to have what they called a casemated battery. And the casemated battery is a huge concrete structure that houses a 100-pound cannon. And because it was early in the war, and because those 100-pounders were in very short supply, and because Hilton Head was a backwater of the war, not high priority, that gun never arrived. So all that we had in place here at Fort Mitchel were 6 20-pounders. And those 6 20-pounders were adequate to defend against anything except an ironclad. And in late 1863, the intelligence staff gets a report that a Confederate steamer is being refit as an ironclad in Savannah Harbor. And now there's tremendous concern that that ironclad can come up Skull Creek from Savannah, withstand the 20-pounders here at the fort, sail into Port Royal Sound, and go down and attack all the ships that are at anchor or unloading their goods on the dock. So a command is given again by General Gilmore, by Captain Gilmore, who had been promoted to general by this time, to build a barrier underwater across Skull Creek from Hilton Head Island to Pinckney Island to block the passage of any Confederate ironclad that might attempt to get into Port Royal Sound. With all of these fortifications, they went on and built other forts on the island. This was the first fort built. It became the first fort completed. Fort Wells was the rebuild of the old Confederate fort. That was completed shortly after this, and then 3 more forts were built while the Union occupied the island. But Fort Mitchel was the one that really had perhaps the most cachet amongst the soldiers. This was a place you wanted to be. No soldier likes to be close to the flagpole. Too many people with too much brass walking around. Too many generals, too many senior officers. Over here at Fort Mitchel, you have a camp of about 700 to 900 soldiers who had regular duties, but they're also able, in their free time, which they had plenty of, to do things like shrimping, fishing, crabbing, they kept pets. They kept pet raccoons in this moat that's just off to my rear, which was filled with water at the time from the spring over near the Port Royal Sound direction of the fort, was filled with water and had alligators. And the soldiers made pets of the alligators, starting a practice that, as you know, is very much illegal on Hilton Head these days. They also had plenty of time to fritter their time away, doing things like gambling and drinking. And in fact, just behind where you're standing now was a sutler, a merchant who had a shop. And that merchant would sell all kinds of goods to the soldiers that they couldn't procure over at the commissary. And among those goods was occasionally moonshine that he was able to procure from the native islanders who made it on their own. And in 1863, about July, this time in 1863, the commanding general, who was my predecessor, who had come back as the general at that time, had to issue an order limiting the distribution of alcohol to 1 gallon per officer per month. That sounds like a lot for one person, but that wasn't for one officer. That was for his staff and then perhaps his senior non-commissioned officers that he wanted to reward. But this was a cushy place. This was where every soldier who was on Hilton Head would love to have had duty. And life at camp here, among the 700 to 900 men who were stationed here at any given time, was really luxurious. And I know that Clara Barton talked about Hilton Head in general, and how life was considered to be extremely luxurious by the rank and file and by the high command of the Union Army. What's interesting is that later in the war, many of the senior generals who had distinguished themselves in battles during the war were sent down here afterwards as commanders of the Reconstruction districts that were headquartered here for 3 years. The fort itself was built on land. It was a flat cotton field, no trees. What they ended up doing was they would take any trees in the surrounding area and they would fell them. They would lay them down horizontally on the ground in the shape of the walls of the fort, and then they would cut more trees and pile those trees in a pyramidal fashion so that you had a pyramid of logs in the shape of the walls of the fort. Then they would start digging on the outside of what they wanted the wall to be. And they would take dirt and heap it up on top of the logs. And they'd keep digging and digging and digging. And that formed the moats that would be on the exterior of the fort. And these walls, at their height, before erosion took place and that type of thing, these were anywhere from typically 12 to 15 feet above the land on the inside of the fort. One other thing was a feature here at the fort that was very important. It was called a bomb-proof, and there were 2 of them here. And those were excavated structures that went about 4 feet underground and had a ceiling that was comprised of saplings, sandbags, and dirt that could withstand a direct artillery hit. Despite all of this defensive preparation, there was never an attack on any one of the forts on Hilton Head. Some Confederate raiders would come over every now and then, take pot shots at the sentries and at the pickets, but that was really about it. And Fort Mitchel was not originally called Fort Mitchell. It was originally named Battery Gilmore, after the chief engineer at the time. But following my death in 1862, on October 30th, after emancipation the following January, this was renamed Fort Mitchell in my honor. So when I was learning more about the history of Hilton Head, and especially the history of the Civil War and then the Reconstruction period following the war, again, General Mitchell's figure stood out brightly in that entire story. He arrives in Hilton Head on the 15th of September in 1862. And he will be sworn in as the commanding general on the 17th, 2 days later. But then he'll spend about 5 days going around the Port Royal Sound area to every Union encampment. And he knows that there's been a problem with the soldiers and the relationships between the former slaves and the soldiers. And so he'll feel that out, get a feel for the pulse of what's happening. He'll come back to Hilton Head on the 22nd of September. And he'll go into the command post for the Union, which is on the 3rd floor of a former plantation owner's home, the Pope family home over in Coggins Point Plantation. And he'll be looking out across the island, virtually no trees, so he has a view of almost the entire part of Hilton Head. And he'll look across the marsh to his north, and he'll see wide open cotton fields that belonged to the former Confederate commander, a man named Thomas Drayton. And as he stands there and he thinks about what he's learned talking to the soldiers and commanders at the various camps around Port Royal, that something drastic needs to be done quickly, needs to be done controllably. And by that, what he was thinking about was, I need to separate the former slaves from the soldiers, but not so far that they can't be defended if needed. And he looks at Drayton's fields and decides that is the place to build a village for these people. So he will come down from that. He'll write a letter to Washington, to the Secretary of the Treasury, who's responsible for all of the former slaves at that point. And he will tell them that he's about ready to build a town for the slaves and he needs money to do it. And without waiting for an answer from Washington on that, the next day he'll issue the order to the 9 sawmills on Hilton Head to begin cutting lumber for the homes in Mitchellville that are to be built for the former slaves. And the building of Mitchel will start somewhere around the 20th of October. He goes even further and he recommends a layout for the town with neat streets, parallel perpendicular grid system. He'll go and recommend a set of rules and regulations that are needed for order and discipline. And then he also goes and recommends a structure for town government. And after all that's done, he attends to the population of former slaves on the island. And he knows that that's going to be a hard persuasion for him to accomplish, to get them to move from the safety of being near the walls of the fort across the marsh to live independently. But he manages to succeed with the help of the informal leadership of the black community. He'll address the congregation at church on October 12th. And on October 13th of 1862, he will write a letter to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and tell him that he is building a home for the slaves. It will be at government expense. He hasn't heard from the Treasury Secretary yet, but he has assumed that it is going to be approved. And he'll go on then and begin to appoint people to build the town of Mitchellville. About a week later, he starts to feel feverish. He's taken into the officers' hospital in Beaufort on the 27th of October, and 3 days later he dies, 45 days after he arrived on Hilton Head. But the power of his vision and how he went about socializing his ideas and accomplishing his aim meant that Mitchellville would go ahead and be constructed and implemented almost without variation from his suggestions. And Mitchellville becomes a key part, the focal point, many people say, of the Port Royal experiment, which was a group of efforts that were designed to prove whether or not the black man formerly enslaved could live in an independent, free society. And it was a resounding success at Mitchellville. So Mitchell's legacy is really as a major step in the road to freedom for enslaved African Americans in a village that was here on Hilton Head Island. And I find that to be tremendously inspirational in relation to that entire story. So